Mrs. Daisy's father had died after a long struggle with illness, and Mrs. Daisy was his only daughter and was very attached to him, especially since her mother died when she was young, and all she had left was her father, who took care of her and categorically refused to marry or be associated with any other woman after Daisy's mother, so as not to cause any pain to Daisy. That's why Daisy tried all the time to take care of him and look after him, just as he had taken care of her when she was young. Although her father's cancer was discovered late, and she knew that he only had a few days to live, she felt a lot of sadness when he died. She suffered from severe depression because of her sense of loss, and it seemed that every part of the house reminded her of her father, and that is why her husband, Mr. Hunt, agreed with her that they start looking for a new home. Maybe her condition will improve. Mr. Hunt knew that his wife had dreamed since her childhood of a large house surrounded by spacious lands in every direction. She dreamed of a simple life that was not spoiled by the development of the city, especially in light of the crimes that spread widely at this time. On this basis, Mr. Hunt began searching. After several months, he found what he was looking for. It was an old house only 10 minutes away from the city by car, but at the same time it included everything that Mrs. Daisy dreamed of and more, as it was in a quiet area, surrounded by vast areas of land, and there was an animal barn and a stable for horses. Of course, Mr. Hunt did not hesitate to talk to the real estate agent offering the house, and Mr. Hunt learned from her the price of the house. The price included the land surrounding the house, and that is why Mr. Hunt tried to reach an agreement with her that would satisfy everyone, and this is exactly what happened, and the house was actually sold to Mr. Hunt. Mr. Hunt was keen to buy new furniture for the house, as he wanted a new beginning with his wife and his entire family, and he did not want to keep any of the old furniture, which of course reminded his wife of her father, who had died several months ago. The house consisted of 5 rooms, so it was each son of Mr. Hunt's family had his own room. They had 2 boys and 1 girl, and it was the dream of each of them to have his own room, especially since they shared the same room in the old house, and that's why they were very happy with the many rooms in the house. And of course there was a 4th room. For Mrs. Daisy and Mr. Hunt, the 5th and last room was the back room and was completely furnished but left empty in case the family had any visitors or needed that room for any reason. The family began to settle into the house, and Mrs. Daisy fell in love with every part of this antique house. She was very happy in her new home and was trying to create new memories with her children. Mrs. Daisy's children also seemed to be very happy, as they were used to spending all hours of the day outside. They played on the ground or followed the plants that their mother grew, or helped her feed the chickens and livestock that she raised. As for Mr. Hunt, he was also happy for the happiness of his family. Here he lives in a dream house, and at the same time, the distance between his home and the city is very short, so he can go to work every day without a problem and then back to his charming home in the evening. Everything was amazing and wonderful for everyone, despite the fact that many strange, incomprehensible, and frightening things happened many times. One time, Jake, Mrs. Daisy's eldest son, came and told her that he had met a large group of friends who lived in the same place, and more than one person told him that there are many previous owners who bought this house before, and a large number of them left the house because it is haunted by someone's spirit or perhaps by something that no one knows about. But Mrs. Daisy told Jake that these stories are just imagination and often spread because of the curiosity of others and their desire to interfere in what did not concern them. And although Jake was not convinced, he did not argue with his mother about what she told him. As for Mr. Hunt, he noticed that the dog, which had lived all its years with the family and was often quiet and slept for long hours, had become very complaining, especially when the family was in the living room. On more than one night, the dog would sleep in the living room, but he would wake up and start barking and complaining as if he was afraid of something. Mr. Hunt was sure that the dog would sometimes look at the wall or down at other times, as if there was someone or something that no one else could see. Even if Mr. Hunt tried to calm the dog, it would continue to bark. Mr. Hunt feels strange about what is happening, but he does not tell anyone about it. As for Mrs. Daisy, she also had her share of strange and terrifying things. One time she was taking a shower, and then she heard someone tapping on the door handle. The handle was a little loose, and it could not make that sound unless someone pressed or tapped on it from below. Mrs. Daisy tried to finish her bath quickly because she thought that someone in the family wanted to use the bathroom, but after she put on her robe and went out, she did not find anyone outside. Mrs. Daisy then thought that perhaps one of the children needed to use the bathroom, but then he left again. Mrs. Daisy started calling for her children, but no one answered her. Here, she went outside to ask the children if one of them wanted to use the bathroom, but they all assured her that they were playing outside, and none of them entered the house. Mrs. Daisy felt worried and remembered the story of Jake was told by his friends before, but she decided to ignore it. On one occasion, Mr. Hunt also heard someone calling his name while he was sleeping, more than 7 times in 3 months. This voice calling for Mr. Hunt was accompanied by the sound of footsteps downstairs, especially when no one else was in the house. And on one of the days Mr. Hunt returned home, and his phone started ringing, and when he looked at the phone, the caller was the home number, the landline. Only Mr. Hunt and Mrs. Daisy were at home, and they both looked at each other without knowing what to do. Then Mr. Hunt asked Mrs. Daisy if she had tried to call, whether he was at work or not, but she assured him that she had not contacted him. It was strange and incomprehensible. One time, Mrs. Daisy also heard her daughter calling for her. Mrs. Daisy was not the only one who heard her daughter's voice, but Mr. Hunt was also with her at the same time and heard the same sound. The sound was coming from the back room of the house. The strange thing is that the girl was not in the house at this time. Strange things did not stop happening, and it was common for them to hear the creaking of the wooden floors or the vibration of the light and many other things. But the thing that frightened Mrs. Daisy greatly was one day on the weekend. Mr. Hunt was at a party at work, while the 3 kids went out to meet friends, and Mrs. Daisy was at home watching television downstairs when she heard a loud sound coming from the bedroom. The sound was like the sound of something falling. It was 10:30, and no one had returned. It was terrifying for Mrs. Daisy, who went to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife she had and remained standing, looking at the stairs heading to the upper floor, not knowing what she should do. Should she go upstairs to check the cause of the noise or call her husband? Finally, she decided to call her eldest son, Jake, who was close to her. Indeed, Jake came quickly with some of his friends, and each of them was carrying something that could help him confront any thief or trespasser. But after they searched all over the house, they did not find anything. All of these stories were told at one of the family gatherings that Mrs. Daisy used to hold for her children and their families. The children had grown up, married, and had their own children. They were keen to visit the family home on long vacations, and one evening they decided to exchange stories about their childhood memories in the farmhouse, and here they began, speaking about it. But the thing that surprised everyone was the story that Mrs. Daisy's daughter, Rose, told them, because she told them that in the summer of 2008, when she decided to repaint her room, she decided to sleep in the empty back room, and even though she was always worried about that room, but she had no other solution, and when she went in to sleep in the room, every time she fell asleep, she felt that someone was pushing her to the edge of the bed. It was annoying, but Rose was tired, so she tried to stay asleep, and she did not care about it and did not tell anyone anything. The mother and Jake looked at each other in shock, and then Mr. Hunt asked them what was happening and why they seemed so worried. So Mrs. Daisy told him that Jake had previously told her the same thing, and she did not find any explanation for him at the time. But she told him not to tell anyone, especially Rose, because she knew that she would be afraid. At the same time, Jeremy, the youngest son of the family, spoke and told them that the same thing had happened to him, but he thought he was imagining and that this had not really happened. The whole family was in a state of shock because of that story and the strange event that none of them knew about until more than 20 years after they moved. Here, Rose started asking her father a lot of questions about the house. What is its history? Who is the person who sold it to him? Any details that could help the family find out the secret of those strange things that happened, and some of which are still happening today. Here, Mr. Hunt told her that he had purchased this house from a real estate marketer who was displaying the house in one of the local newspapers, and the price of the house at this time was normal. He does not know anything about the history of the house or its previous owners. Here, Jeremy suggested that they search on the internet. Perhaps he could find anything about the farmhouse that would help them understand what has been happening to them since they lived in this house until now. Jeremy began his search on the Google search engine, but he did not find anything related to the house other than some old pictures in local newspapers from the time the house was put up for sale. Here, he decided to change his search location and start searching on social networking sites and sites for exchanging personal experiences. And here he came across one of the old publications. Written by the grandson of one of the old owners of the house, it tells everything about the house. The farmhouse was built around 1900 and was then owned by a man called Gabriel and his wife Eleanor. Eleanor only had one girl and her name was Camilla. Camilla was a smart and beautiful girl, and she loved agriculture and animals like her father and mother. Camilla learned from a young age everything related to working on the farm. At that time, the house was surrounded by many acres that also belonged to Camilla's family. When Camilla was a teenager, her father died, and only she and her mother remained responsible for everything on the farm. The work was good, but hard, especially for Camilla, who was still young to bear all these burdens. But despite from that, she had to endure so as not to let her mother down and help her, and so as not to make her feel that she was alone and doing everything without anyone's help. Camilla grew up and became 18 years old, and here she met Greg. He was a handsome young man. He was 20 years old at the time. Camilla fell in love with him and he also loved her. Camilla and Greg got married and they had only one son. Years passed in that small family and there were many problems, but Camilla and Greg were able to overcome them. Mrs. Eleanor grew up and was no longer able to work, so Camilla reassured her that she would do everything for her and she shouldn't worry anymore. Indeed, Camilla and Greg did all the work on the farm and started the workers, and everything was good, except for only one thing, which was Noah, the son of Camilla and Greg. Noah was a naughty child, and when he grew up, he became a rebellious teenager. He used to exhaust Camilla and did not listen to anything she said, and he was always quarreling with others and caused a lot of problems. But Camilla never lost hope in him and was always keen to talk to him in order to change his behavior. But he was stubborn and always saw that she wanted to control him. Of course, he refused this and spoke to her violently, until this day came when she discovered that her son had a relationship with the daughter of one of the farm workers against her will. And when she told him that he had to marry her because Mrs. Camilla was religious, he did not agree to that and fled from the house. One day, while the family was sleeping, Noah gathered all his belongings and fled from the house. And since then Lady Camilla did not hear anything from him. Mrs. Camilla and Mr. Greg tried to continue life normally, but they both missed Noah very much. And although none of them wanted to be honest with each other about it, they both knew how the other felt. The house that was full of life and sounds turned into a quiet house without any sound. Dead house. The years passed hard and slow for Mr. Greg and Mrs. Camilla until they finally received a letter from Noah telling them that he had decided to volunteer for the American Army and that he had decided to become a better person so that they would accept him again. Mrs. Camilla was very sad because Noah believed that she did not want him, but in reality she missed him greatly, and so did his father, who was keen to work continuously to take his mind off Noah and what might happen to him after he volunteered for the army. The family followed news about the army every day in order to reassure themselves about their only son, Noah. For 10 years, the family did not receive any letter that could reassure them about Noah until his father lost hope that he was alive, while Mrs. Camilla was certain that her son was alive and not dead, as his father said. And one day Mrs. Camilla went to wake up her husband, Greg, but he did not answer her. She felt fear squeezing her heart and approached his face to listen to the sound of his breathing, but nothing. Mrs. Camilla knew that her husband had died, and she said goodbye to him with great sadness. She was greatly affected that Noah had not said goodbye to his father, and that Mr. Greg had died before seeing his son for the last time. But despite that, she maintained the progress of work on the farm and was following everything that happened. But it was only a few weeks later the second hit came to Mrs. Camilla when she found her mother dead. This time she could not bear it, and her nerves collapsed, and she had to be placed in the hospital until she calmed down and became better. Mrs. Camilla spent a whole week in the hospital. What saddened her most was that Greg was not with her and by her side when her mother died, and that she did not know anything about her only son. When she left the hospital, Mrs. Camilla lost any desire to live and was completely devastated. She would not go out to work on the farm. She does not meet anyone. All day and night inside the house, no one knows what she is doing and whether she is okay or not. Even whoever goes to visit her at home, she refuses to meet him and does not open the doors for him. Everyone appreciated the bad psychological state of Mrs. Camilla, and that is why no one wanted to force themselves on her or force her to go out or meet them. But days passed without Lady Camilla leaving the house or anyone seeing her, until that day when one of the workers came and confirmed that she had a very bad feeling about Mrs. Camilla's disappearance. The worker said that Mrs. Camilla loved her work and her farm, and she could not stay away for that long without being reassured about the progress of the work. Something bad must have happened to her. Here, a group of workers on the farm agreed to go in the evening to see Mrs. Camilla and check on her. When they went in the evening, they knocked on the door a lot, but no one answered them. One of the workers went to the back door of the house and knocked again, but nothing happened either. But he noticed that there was a very bad smell was coming from inside the house, so he rushed to tell the rest of his colleagues, and they decided together to force open the door in order to enter and find out what was happening inside, especially since suspicion had seeped into all of them that something very bad had happened to Mrs. Camilla, and unfortunately, they confirmed this suspicion when they entered. They went to the house and found Mrs. Camilla dead and in a very bad condition. The workers were very sad for Mrs. Camilla because she was a kind woman who loved everyone and helped them all the time. They decided to bury her in the cemetery near the city, and they actually buried her, and there were those who volunteered to clean the house after the chaos caused by Mrs. Camilla's body, which the workers found after her death several days. More than 3 years have passed since the death of Mrs. Camilla, and one winter day, a handsome man arrived. He looked a lot like Mr. Gregg. People were looking at him and did not know who this man was. This man went to the farmhouse and entered there, and someone asked him who he was, so he told him, Noah, son of Mr. Gregg and Mrs. Camilla. Noah left him and went to his family's home. He knocked on the door many times, but to no avail. He still had the house key with him, and when he used it and entered the house, he did not find anyone. He did not find his father, mother, and grandmother. He went out to look for them outside, and then he met the same person who asked him who he was, and here Noah asked him about his family. So the man told him that 3 years ago, Mr. Gregg died, and a few weeks after him, the grandmother died, and it seems that Mrs. Camilla could not bear it and died from grief for her husband and mother. Noah felt sad and remorseful because he left his family and his mother and did not return once to check on them. He felt a great longing for them and thought that they were still waiting for him and would receive him after all these years. But all of these things did not happen, and he was only greeted by a house completely empty of people and life. Noah cried a lot at home, especially since he saw his mother, father, and grandmother in all the rooms of the house. The only place he did not see them was the back room, and that is why he would stay there for long periods of time. But one day he decided that he could no longer bear it anymore. It was all beyond his ability to endure, and here he decided to end his life. He decided to go to the garage and hang himself. Jeremy was reading, and everyone was moved by what they were hearing, but he wasn't finished yet. Jeremy continued and said that all this information was in a diary that the grandson of one of the owners of the house found after his grandfather died in the hospital when he and his siblings went to clean the house, and they found those diaries hidden on the floor of the back room. And the author of the post confirmed that there were many modifications that had been made to the house, whether by his grandfather or by the other owners, and that everything his grandfather saw and heard in the house was terrifying, and he could not find any explanation for it. But those diaries explained everything. Here, the family members of Mrs. Daisy and Mr. Hunt confirmed that the author of the post was right, and despite everything the family knew on this day, this did not change anything for them regarding the farmhouse, especially Mrs. Daisy, who felt the same pain that Mrs. Camilla felt and sympathized with her a lot.